Today we are joined by Kevin Weddle. Kevin was a professor of military theory and strategy at the U.S. Army War College after spending 30 years in the U.S. Army and is the author of The Complete Victory, Saratoga and the American Revolution, which will be linked in the description below. The Saratoga campaign was the 1777 campaign in the Northern Theater of the American Revolution, which led to British General John Burgoyne's complete surrender. Many historians refer to Saratoga as the turning point of the Revolutionary War. Enjoy the episode. Well, Kevin, welcome to American History Gazette.
Well, thanks, Jake. I'm excited to be here.
Now, I'm only about halfway through the book right now, unfortunately. I'm a slow reader, and I've been pretty busy over the past couple of days, but I have to say, it's absolutely fantastic. I mean, it's right up there with David McCullough's work, Joseph Ellis' work. I think your background in military strategy has really served you well here because it's not just a historical narrative. It's very much so interwoven with the military strategy of what was going on. And it paints a wonderful picture, a very clear picture of what was going on in my head while I'm reading it, which I think you can usually grade a book, especially a book about something that took place when there was no photos, no videos. You can really grade a book on how good it is based on how clear of a picture it paints in your head, at least for me. And I just got to say, it's absolutely phenomenal. But coming from a military background, you're a professor in military strategy. Why did you write this book? What inspired you to delve into the Saratoga campaign?
Yeah. Well, it kind of goes all the way back to when I was a cadet at West Point. And of course, West Point's just south of the whole where all this played out. And they taught us a lot of Revolutionary War history there because it's just all around. It's at West Point. It's all around West Point. And then when I went off into the Army and then I returned to West Point to teach history, of course, I taught Saratoga and took cadets up to the Saratoga battlefield. So that was the first time I was able to actually visit the area. And so I really got interested in it then. But then, of course, I went off to the Army and, I'm doing other things for many, many years. And then came back to teach at the Army War College. I'm mainly a Civil War historian, actually, not a Revolutionary War historian. So my first book was on a Civil War admiral, believe it or not. And Oxford University Press asked me if I'd be interested in writing about Saratoga, because they had this series of, they have a series called Pivotal Moments in American History. And of course, Saratoga is obviously a pivotal moment in American history, just like they have other volumes on the Civil War Act, or the Civil Rights Act, and the Battle of Antietam and the Battle of Gettysburg, and things like that. So obviously, I jumped at the chance to do that because of my interest in it, and not being mainly a Revolutionary War historian, I think I may have approached it from maybe a more fresh perspective. I don't know. And I'm not sure if my military background helped at all, because there's so many. I'm a firm believer that you don't have to be don't have to have military experience to be a great military historian. Look how many great military historians out there: Bruce Catton and Rick Atkinson. My mentor at Princeton when I got my PhD, Jim McPherson, none of them had military experience, and they all are brilliant military historians. But I do think having a military background, having served 30 years in the Army, does bring some maybe different perspectives on things. I certainly understand what it's like to, slog through the woods, tired, wet, hungry, muddy, operating on 2 hours of sleep over 6 days, and things like that. So I've experienced a lot of the things that these folks experience, so I can certainly understand where they're coming from, and maybe it gives me a little bit more empathy
Yeah.
for them on the, sort of some of the tasks they had to accomplish.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. It definitely has to give you a certain level of empathy and understanding that just isn't possible unless you've sort of been through experiences like that. So you can probably put yourself in their shoes and what it must have been like to be there. But your title, The Complete Victory, many people might wonder why complete is spelled like that. And it's actually a pretty cool anecdote. So can you just explain the title?
Yeah, it's funny when my editor and I we were casting about, trying to think of a cool title, because if you've looked at any other Saratoga, almost every Saratoga book is, the turning point or the
Yeah.
tipping point, or Saratoga the turning point Saratoga. It's got something like that. I didn't want that. I wanted something else. And as I was going through going through these papers, I came across General John Nixon, who had written on the day, was it the day after or a couple days after the surrender at Saratoga on the 17th of October. Um, he wrote a friend, fellow general in Boston, and he's writing, describing everything, and he said it was the complete victory. And I read that and I go, wow, that is great. And I wasn't thinking of it as a book title at the time. I was thinking that's got to be a chapter title for sure. And then the more I started thinking about it, I go, no, that'd be a great um, title for the book. Because it does bring it was a complete victory. I mean,
Yeah.
we captured a enemy army. We bring, the French come into the war, boosts American morale. All those things that came out of the victory at Saratoga, um, uh, kind of lent it to that descriptive title. And of course, it's spelled differently because, at the time.
Mhm.
Um, at least as far as I can tell, there it was spelled both ways at the time, and I thought, well, it's a direct quote from the guy, so I'm gonna use the old. And we thought about it. The editor and I kind of, yeah, should we modernize the spelling? And the marketing people aren't going to like that, and things like that. So no, let's stick with the original. It might actually grab people's attention, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah. No, I think you made the right choice because it's a very profound message of what he wrote, but it also sets you apart. Like you said, all the Saratoga works are something revolving around the turning point. So it kind of sets you apart from all of those. But let's delve into it now. The Saratoga campaign took place in 1777 in the Northern Theater of the Revolutionary War, but a lot had happened up to this point. So can you kind of set the stage for me on the context of the Northern Department leading up to the Saratoga campaign?
Sure. The Northern Department is interesting in that it was established by Congress, not by George Washington, as the commander in chief. Even though he was still, overall in charge of everything, it was actually kind of Congress had established that. And because as you know, in this early period, all the way up through really the War of 1812, Americans really covet Canada. I mean, we wanted Canada, and as part of the Revolution, that was one of our goals. And of course, we send an expedition up there in 1775 into 1776. It fails to seize Quebec. Benedict Arnold is involved in that, who will, of course, be a major player in the Saratoga campaign. And then the British reinforcements come in the spring and summer of 1776, and the British push the Americans out of Canada, force them back, all the way back into New York, with the main post being Albany and Fort Ticonderoga. Uh, so the British then, under General Sir Guy Carleton, who gets his knighthood because he does push the Americans out of Canada. He is the commander. He's the British commander-in-chief in Canada, not to be confused with General Howe, who is the commander-in-chief in the rest of the Americas. But Carleton embarks on a expedition to come down Lake Champlain. It's actually, it can get very confusing because Lake Champlain drains north. So when you say come down, you're actually, anyway,
Yeah.
He's head south on Lake Champlain. And because of the lateness of the season, his late start, he's forced to basically not continue his campaign to take Fort Ticonderoga, and he'll withdraw back up into Canada. Included in that is the famous, of course, Battle of Valcour Island, which the Navy likes to latch hold of as the kind of the birth of the United States Navy. But it's a naval battle on Lake Champlain, led by with the Americans under, again, Benedict Arnold. He's everywhere. He's like the Forrest Gump. I mean, he's everywhere in this early part of the war.
It's hilarious.
He's at, he helps seize Fort Ticonderoga. He's up fighting in Canada, trying to seize Quebec. He's fighting this naval battle. So the British retreat back. And at the same time, of course, Washington has fought the battles of Long Island and Manhattan. He's been pushed off New York, away from New York. He retreats across New Jersey in the late summer, early into the fall of 1776. He retreats across New Jersey. The army is hemorrhaging soldiers by desertion. Howe will follow slowly along, hoping that the American Revolution is just going to fall apart because Washington's army is falling apart. Then Washington, of course, will turn the tide at the battles of Trenton and Princeton in late 1776, early 1777. So at that point, the British kind of step back and they start. They said, we really need to do kind of a reassessment here. And let's look at 1777 as the year that we're going to crush the rebellion and end this thing once and for all. So they do that in London mainly. And this is where I spend a lot of time in the book talking about the strategy because they'll try to put together this war-winning strategy for 1777. And it just does not work out very well for them. Instead of having one, I don't know how much detail you want me to get into, Jake, but instead of having one unified, focused military strategy for 1777, they will end up with two totally, almost completely unconnected military strategies, neither of which will support each other. And so they will fritter away their combat power. Instead of focusing on one of these strategies, they'll instead try to do these two unconnected, uncoordinated strategies. And ultimately that will, to me anyway, I argue that the seeds of the loss of the army at Saratoga is laid in London when they develop this strategy 6-7 months before that even happens, the surrender happens. Because, there's that old military adage that even the best tactics can't overcome a bad strategy. And I think this is a perfect example of that even though you had this professional army, this professional British army going up against these more or less amateur Americans, their strategy was so faulty and so muddled and so uncoordinated that it was almost doomed to failure from the very beginning. And then I also make the argument, though, that even a bad strategy vigorously executed with a commander who's got some imagination can yield some dividends. Unfortunately for the British, in this case, I don't think John Burgoyne, the British commander, was that guy.
Yeah, what's the patent quote? I think it's a good plan violently executed now is better than a perfect plan next week. So It shows you that sometimes the plan doesn't need to be perfect. It's about execution. But I would like to flesh flesh out Burgoyne's movements in London and how that plan came to be in a moment. But I want to zero in on Carleton real quick, because on his campaign in 1776 down Lake Champlain, he seizes Crown Point, which is this post sort of 10 miles north of Ticonderoga. It's going great. He destroys Benedict Arnold's fleet at the Battle of Valcour Island, but he decides to withdraw back to Canada after seizing this ground and achieving this military victory. And I know he got a lot of scrutiny for that. So why exactly did Carleton retreat back to Canada after gaining that ground?
Yeah, I think well, I think there's a couple reasons why. I think the Americans had done a pretty good job of restoring, because Fort Ticonderoga was in pretty poor shape
Mm-hmm.
in early mid 1776, and they had sent General Gates up there to renovate the fort, make it more defensible. He had done a really good job with that, and I think part of the issue is after he seizes Crown Point very easily. Of course, the Americans abandoned Crown Point
Mm-hmm.
and pulled the troops back to Fort Ticonderoga. When he sent patrols forward to kind of check out Fort Ticonderoga, he saw a pretty a pretty formidable fortification there now. And I think they thought it was going to be in much more depressed state. And especially after he just blasted through the American fleet at Valcour Island, I think he thought it would be a fairly straightforward proposition to get to Ticonderoga. But his patrols showed that it wasn't. It wasn't going to be a cakewalk. And with the he's making this decision early part of November. I mean, it's in that part of the world, it's getting pretty cold, and the he can see the season is rapidly advancing, and he doesn't want to fight a winter war at all. He already did that in 1775 into 1776 up in Quebec. And he doesn't want to do that at the end of a tenuous line of communications. And so I think all of that kind of makes up his mind that this just isn't in the cards for this season. And that's why he pulls back. And as you mentioned, he gets a lot of criticism for that, mainly George Germain, the British Secretary of State for the Colonies, who's really the guy in charge of managing the war in North America. And they had already butted heads up to this point, so their relationship just collapses after he decides to pull back.
Yeah, but was Crown, because he sees Crown Point, which is this fort, this post, was that not really in any state to be a winter encampment? Could
No,
he
I
not have
think it was
out there?
yeah, it had really fallen into ruin after the French and Indian War, and had not been really improved since. And any of those frontier forts, they needed constant maintenance. Pardon me. They needed constant maintenance because of well, if you've spent any time up in upstate New York or say northern Minnesota or something like that, if you own a cabin or something like that, I mean, it's constantly you have to do maintenance because of the tough seasons. And they just didn't do it. And so Crown Point was really not very defensible at all. He would have had to put a lot of work into that in order to make that an overwintering kind of place. That was one of the criticisms, of course, that Germain, gave, and Burgoyne too, because Burgoyne is his subordinate during this campaign. Burgoyne is hopping mad. I mean, he wanted to continue on, and as a minimum, he wanted to stay there then over the winter. But anyway, it was up to Carleton. He had to make the decision, and he thought that it just wasn't doable.
Speaking of Burgoyne, let's get into him now. He's the second in command at this point, and following the 1776 campaign, he travels back to London to meet with Germain and formulate the plans for the 1777 campaign, which is what you mentioned earlier. And in my mind, while I'm reading this, it seems that he's over there playing political chess. He's trying to get his foot in the door and get in good graces with the king and with Germain to eventually get his own command. He's a very ambitious guy. So what exactly is he scheming while he's in London? What's the plan that him and Germain come up with?
Absolutely, and your assessment, I think, is absolutely on point. He goes home from Canada, ostensibly with just to carry Carleton's report back to Germain, and he does that. And he also, of course, Germain, or excuse me, in Carleton's report, explaining why he abandoned Crown Point, went back to Canada, and all that. In Carleton's report, Carleton also basically has the seeds, presents the seeds of what would become the Saratoga campaign in 1777. Said, oh, well, when campaigning season comes around again in the spring, basically we'll head south on Lake Champlain again. We'll seize Ticonderoga. We'll move on to Albany. So it's sort of the seeds of what happens. So Burgoyne will take that plan. He'll present that to both the king and Germain. And obviously, you're exactly right. He's clearly putting himself forward as the guy who should command this particular operation. He argues that Carleton should stay in Canada. He's the commander in chief there. He's also the political leader up there. So it's important that he sort of stays there, holds the fort. I'll be the guy to take this expedition. And then Burgoyne will then add other elements to the plan. So the main army will come down from Canada, travel down Lake Champlain, seize Fort Ticonderoga, continue on to Albany. There would then be a supporting force that would go up the St. Lawrence River into Lake Ontario, and then come down the Mohawk River Valley in western New York, go down the Mohawk River Valley to then meet the main army at Albany. So hopefully that army which would be a much smaller force, would Burgoyne hoped would draw off American troops away from the main effort to allow them to get to Albany fairly easily. And then the final piece of that was Burgoyne said, okay, then also the main army that's in New York under the commander-in-chief, General Howe, would come up the Hudson and meet all three of those columns would essentially link up in Albany. And then they would do some sort of follow-on operations into Connecticut toward Massachusetts. That last part of the plan was totally nebulous. I mean, it was almost a hand wave kind of thing. Literally, it was like in one sentence. Oh, and then we're going to do this other stuff too.
Yeah, completely unspecified.
That's right. So the main part of the whole plan was, we're gonna have these three columns. Part of the assumption was that by conducting those operations, you're going to split off the more or what was thought to be the more rebellious New England states. By controlling the Hudson River Valley, you split off the more rebellious New England states away from the less rebellious, or so it was thought, less rebellious middle colonies and southern colonies. And that way you can really focus on destroying all that opposition up in New England, and that's going to win the war. So it's kind of like, okay, we're all going to meet at Albany, and good things will happen after that. So that's Burgoyne's plan. The king loved it. Germain loved it. It seemed like everybody had this kind of obsession with this invasion, route from Canada and then coming up the Hudson River. They loved that idea. Howe, who is the commander in chief, remember, he's sitting in New York. His headquarters in New York. So remember, Burgoyne is sitting in London with the king and Germain. Two key decision makers, obviously. And then you got, of course, the commander-in-chief sitting there in New York. He presents his own plan. After Trenton and Princeton, Howe believed that the only way we're going to win this war is if we destroy Washington and his army. And that they are, by this time, he had come to the realization, rightly, I believe, that Washington and his army was the center of gravity of the American Revolution. You destroy Washington and his army, and the revolution's done. So you can almost look at the way Howe viewed Washington and his army as the Union viewed Lee and his army. Until you take out Lee and his army, the Civil War will continue to drag on. And I think Howe made that conclusion. And I think Howe was absolutely right about that piece of his conclusion. His plan is, okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my army. I'm going to load it on transports, and with the Royal Navy supporting me, I'm going to take my army down up the Chesapeake Bay and attack Philadelphia from the south and seize Philadelphia. And the whole idea being, if I seize Philadelphia, Washington will have to defend it. Or if I threaten Philadelphia, Washington will have to defend it, and I will have my decisive battle, and I'll be able to destroy him. Revolution over. He wants to go by sea because he's already run into all sorts of issues with maintaining long overland lines of communication. I mean, that was part of the problem with Trenton. Part of the problem with Princeton as well is Washington is striking these outposts. And so he has no stomach for that. And so that's why he wants to use the Navy. And his brother-in-law is commander-in-chief of the Royal Navy in North America, or his brother is commander-in-chief of the Royal Navy in North America. So there's no problems with Army-Navy cooperation there. So he knows that will work out very well. So those are the two plans, and both these plans come to the king and Germain. They have to reconcile these two plans. They're obviously very, very different plans. And so, how do you do that if you're George Germain and King George III? Well, I think logically you would either, at least, that's what we would do today. You would pick one and go with it.
Right.
And focus all your efforts on that plan, or you somehow coordinate them so they're supporting each other. And they kind of try to do that. And I think this is because they're showing some deference to the commander-in-chief. They end up basically approving both plans. So they say, okay, Burgoyne, you embark on your plan. Howe, you embark on your plan. But General Howe, once you're done in Philadelphia, then you need to go up the Hudson and support Burgoyne. All Howe sees, I've been approved to do my plan. And that's what he goes off on and does the plan. And fairly early on, he'll write to both Germain and to Carleton, who is charged with preparing Burgoyne's army for this operation. He basically tells them, hey, don't count on me coming up the Hudson River anytime soon, because it's going to take me a while to take care of Philadelphia and to destroy Washington's army. So I hope you guys aren't counting on me.
Yeah.
And so consequently, you've got these two strategies that are going to diverge, and they're both going to end up failing in the end.
Yeah, I think this is really where we start to see them sowing the seeds of their own demise, and it's where we see sort of a split in the command, because you have all these dissenting views and these differentiating opinions on how to conduct the war. And then Germain, I think he very poorly managed the war, but also there were some other factors at play. But he approves both, which is just wild because they're two completely different plans. And I think a lot of them were wearing rose-colored glasses and falsely optimistic that they could just breeze right through. They definitely underestimated the Americans and the colonies and their resolve and what they were fighting for. I know you wrote in the book that one of their downfalls was that they didn't understand what the Americans were fighting for and the amount of resolve they had. So they underestimated them there. They approved two different plans. Howe, all he needed was the green light. He didn't care about reading the fine print. All he saw was you can go to Philadelphia, and he left. But what I've heard you call it the tyranny of distance, and I think this is, among other reasons, Britain's greatest downfall, and they're one of the biggest reasons that they lost the war. So can you just explain what the tyranny of distance is, and how this impacted sort of the miscommunication and animosity?
Sure. This is a great example of that. They're going to be dealing with that throughout the entire war. But when you have decision makers in New York and decision makers in London, and they're 3,000 miles away, and in the mid late 18th century, that means a message going one way is going to take up to 6 weeks, maybe more, especially if it's going east to west against prevailing winds. So that means an exchange of messages can take 2-3 months. So when you're trying to micromanage the war, like Germain often does, not always, but often he tries to do that. That means it's going to be really difficult. I mean, how do you coordinate anything? You send a message to Howe. Howe gets it, and he goes, "Okay, I see what you're saying here. I really don't understand paragraph 3. Can you clarify paragraph 3?" And that's going to take 6 weeks to get back to him, and then another 6 weeks to get back to him. And then, so how can you expect any timely operations? Of course, what they should have done was, basically give the commander in chief, pick the right people, obviously, give the commander in chief the wherewithal or the permission to basically conduct operations as he sees fit, and provide as the resources as best you can on what he needs to do. And of course, that they don't do. And you made a great point about underestimating. They underestimate Americans. They underestimate American resolve. They also underestimate the challenges of conducting operations in America. It's very different than the plains of Europe. All these guys, especially Burgoyne and Germain, had all their military experience, virtually all their military experience had been on the plains of Europe. And that's much different from operating in the wilderness in upstate New York. Very, very different. And Howe understood that because Howe had served in America in the French and Indian War. Burgoyne doesn't understand that, even though he served briefly under Carleton. And they just don't get it. And it's such a challenge. It's so different. I mean, there are no good roads. There are no big towns. There aren't any places where you can live off the land. It's just very, very difficult, and they don't get that. Howe, I think, understands it. How I think, as I talked about in the book, Howe had the right idea. I think he understood the challenges that he faced there. And I think if Germain and the rest of them understood that, they would have made different decisions.
Yeah, 100%. I think the geography was the second biggest reason for Britain's downfall. The distance and the lack of clear communication, and the geography. I know in the book you stated in war, geography is everything, and we definitely see that here. I think that's one of the biggest reasons that the British ultimately lose. And you're right. I mean, if they had given full discretion to the commanders in America at that time, pick the right people like Howe. I think Howe is a good commander. If they would have given them full discretion and not tried to micromanage from 3,000 miles away, it might have played out differently. But Burgoyne is put in charge of the Northern Department, the army in the Northern Department. He is now head of command after he travels back to America, to the colonies for the 1777 campaign, the Saratoga campaign. So he's in charge now. What are the state of the two armies heading into the 1777 campaign? Because you now have Burgoyne in charge. You have the Americans who have been given plenty of time to kind of reassemble after Carleton's retreat, but they don't necessarily take full advantage of that. So, what are the state of the two armies?
Yeah, yeah. Um, well, the army coming down from Canada is the British Army is pretty impressive. It's around 10,000. They're mainly regulars, both British regulars and German regulars. Not Hessians, but these are Brunswickers mainly. Even though most people just kind of uses Hessians as shorthand for Germans, but they were mainly from Brunswick or Braunschweig, I guess. And then there are also there's a number of Canadians, Canadian militia kind of folks, and loyalists as well. So it's a pretty impressive army. They also have a pretty sizable contingent of Native Americans that are going to be attached to the army. They're going to be a little bit problematic. Maybe we can talk about those guys a little bit later.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the British Army. So they're well trained, but again, most of these guys in this army have little or no experience campaigning in America. So even though they're professional, they're well led. I mean, I would argue, and I do argue in the book, that from like the colonel level on down, both sides have really good leadership. Really, really good leadership. I mean, these guys are good natural leaders. The British guys very professional. The Americans are again more natural leaders than experienced military leaders. But on the other hand, there's actually the American Army has many of these guys have more combat experience, believe it or not, than the British Army guys. But at any rate, okay, so that's the British Army. Commanded by, of course, Burgoyne. His nominal second in command is Major General Phillips, who's mainly an artilleryman, and then he's got the German Major General Riedesel as well. So those are his the big three from the British Army. On the American side, the American Northern Department is commanded by Philip Schuyler, who is he served in the French and Indian War. He's lived his entire life in the Albany, Saratoga area, so he knows the area very, very well, like the back of his hand, actually. He's kind of this upper-class patrician kind of guy. He's not particularly well liked by the militia because of this kind of upper-class, kind of look down his nose at the underclass kind of guy. He's considered kind of haughty, so he's not particularly well liked. But the Americans are a mixture of continental, regular soldiers who have had quite a bit of experience in the earlier Canadian campaign, and also the fighting around Boston as well. And then a lot of militia forces as well. Very few Native Americans on the American side. Very, very few. There will be, in other parts of the campaign, there will be Native Americans fighting with American forces that will be important, but that's a different part of the campaign. So he's pretty well outnumbered. He's got up against this 10,000 British army. Schuyler has maybe about 6,000. You're right. They have plenty of time to improve the fortifications around Ticonderoga and other fortifications, but they don't do it. They really don't take advantage of that time at all. And part of the problem is Schuyler, after the 1776 campaign, felt like he really hadn't gotten his due by turning back the British in 1776. So he basically leaves his command, travels to Philadelphia to complain to Congress. In the meantime, Congress had sent Major General Gates, Horatio Gates, up to take charge of Ticonderoga like he had done in 1776 and continue to improve it. Gates instead, because Gates is very, very ambitious, he basically says, well, Schuyler's not here. I'm going to basically take over command of the Northern Department. And he makes his headquarters in Albany instead of Ticonderoga, like he had been directed to do by Congress. So you have this situation, this very kind of muddled command and control on the American side. And I take both Congress and General Washington to task in the book for not kind of unscrewing the screw up there in the Northern Department, and that lasts for several months. And when good, strong leadership would have made sure that Ticonderoga was ready to face anything, but instead there's a series of commanders who go up there. There's an engineer up at Ticonderoga who really doesn't know what he's doing. He's a well-meaning guy. He's a brave guy. He fought at, I believe it was at the Battle of Bunker Hill. So, I mean, this guy had been in there from the start. Really brave guy, really dedicated guy, but he wasn't a very good engineer. And so they're spending hundreds and hundreds, thousands of man hours building fortifications that are poorly sited, not well constructed. And so what could have been a very formidable fortification there at Ticonderoga ends up being much less so when they end up having to face Burgoyne in late June, early July, 1777.
Yeah, the engineer that you're talking about, not necessarily the best man for the job, but there was an engineer that was the right man for the job, Thaddeus Kosciuszko. I believe I'm pronouncing that correctly. But
I've heard a million different pronunciations.
yeah,
I was always told it was Kosciuszko, but I don't know.
yeah,
I've
whatever.
heard, yeah,
We get the point. But
the Polish guy.
Polish engineer. I was in DC 2 weeks ago, and I was in Lafayette Square, where they have statues of foreign allies from the Revolution in four corners, and they have Baron von Steuben, Rochambeau, Lafayette, and they had this guy Kosciuszko. And I when I went, I didn't know who he was, so I was very delighted to see him in your book to learn more about his role. And he was a very gifted Polish engineer, saw the state of things at Ticonderoga and was like, this is all wrong. We need to be doing this. And he wasn't listened to, right?
Right, exactly. Gates, to his great credit, recognized how good Kosciuszko was, and he sent him up to Ticonderoga to, provide advice. But Kosciuszko is number one. He's outranked by this engineer up there, and he's hesitant to, like any of us would be. Hey, go up there and see how it's going, and you don't want to say, hey, all this work that you've done has been totally worthless. I mean, you don't want to, dash this guy's hard work. But by the same token, he's going, yeah, but I think we need to do these other things. And you're right. He's pretty much ignored. He'll end up being a hero or one of the heroes of Saratoga later. But he's pretty much ignored. It's funny, Kosciuszko. I first learned about Kosciuszko as an 18-year-old cadet at West Point, because there's a statue of Kosciuszko, because he helped build and site all the fortifications at West Point. Mm-hmm. So anybody who goes to West Point, Kosciuszko is kind of drilled into your head from the very beginning. He's always been one of my heroes. And I was a combat engineer for my career in the Army. So Kosciuszko, of course, is a hero to any American combat engineer.
He's got a soft spot in your heart. But I wanna flesh out something that I always find fascinating in military history, because it's easy to look back at history and sort of be a little bit detached and kind of dehumanize it and just look at the events and how they played out through history. But I like really humanizing the history and putting myself in the shoes of the people who were there. And I think one of the things that always fascinates me with the downfall of armies and defeat is ego and its role in warfare. And we really see this here. I mean, with Burgoyne and his inflated sense of ego and his overconfidence, with Gates and Schuyler and Arnold and all their bickering. And obviously, you're much more of a military expert than I am, but it seems to me that ego is more often than not the downfall of armies. What can you say to ego and greed when it comes to war?
Yeah. Yeah, maybe instead of greed, ambition might be
Yeah,
a better
for
word.
sure,
But
for
but
sure.
yeah, you're right. Um, yeah. On the other hand, I think you're absolutely right, and you certainly see it here, as you said, throughout the campaign. And the Americans certainly aren't immune to that. The British have all these problems. All the they Carleton and Germain absolutely despise each other. Howe and Germain will end up despising each other. Howe and Clinton hate each other, and Clinton is Howe's second in command. So I mean that's a problem, obviously. Um, about the only two guys who really like each other on the British side are Clinton and Burgoyne. But even that's a problem because Clinton thinks he should have commanded that expedition because he had date of rank on. He was slightly senior to Burgoyne. So I mean, they just had a poisonous relationship amongst all these senior officers, and that had to play that did play a role clearly. The Americans did too, as you said. Gates basically has very little respect for Washington by this point, and he's very, very ambitious. He thinks he's better than Washington. He's angling for this independent command, which is one of the reasons why he when he's sent up to command Ticonderoga, he instead installs himself as the Northern Commander in Chief there in Albany instead, in Schuyler's absence. And then you have Schuyler pouting about I'm not being treated well enough, so he runs down to whine to Congress. Um, and then of course Arnold and the famous quarrel between Arnold and Gates. They actually worked very, very well together up till that point. They had worked very, very well together in the 1776 campaign. In fact, Gates basically saves Arnold's career during that period because people are very jealous of Arnold. And they're trying to take him down. They're accusing him of all sorts of malfeasance and, basically inflating his expenses and all this other stuff. And Gates basically protects Arnold. Arnold is thrilled when when Schuyler is relieved by Gates. So they get along very well. It's only after that first battle that they start coming to they start butting heads. So, the Americans have their own problems, but I think the fact that the Americans had the easier strategic um, challenge, they're able to overcome those personality issues, and the British just aren't. But you're absolutely right. I think that's definitely a problem. I think ego can be a problem. It can get in the way of things, clearly. But then again, on the other hand, when you look at the great captains in history, and by great captains, I mean really great commanders. I would put Washington up there.
For sure.
I would, obviously, the Napoleons and the Marlboroughs and
Patton
Patton,
had a huge
absolutely.
ego.
Yeah, exactly. All those guys have huge egos. And it's just the guys that can control it and channel those egos. They're the ones that are able to come out on top. You've got other guys like I would say Gates is one of those who had this huge ego and this huge level of ambition. He's not able to do that. Um, and, and I think one of the things with Gates, it's interesting reading some of the reviews of the book, not the formal reviews, but like on Amazon and things like that. And there's people who are out there saying, "Oh, you're a Gates lover, and you think Gates is great. I think he stinks, or whatever." And I don't know how you can read my book and say I'm a Gates lover at all. But I think I'm trying to be fair with Gates. And I think what the problem, as you mentioned just a few minutes ago, and I think you're exactly right, Jake. You're talking about how you have to be really fair to these guys. You have to put yourself in their shoes and not think about what happens later. And I think Gates's problem, or Gates's curse maybe, is a lot of historians have looked at Gates in the Saratoga campaign through the lens of what happens after Saratoga, when he, has that disastrous Battle of Camden, and he's basically trying to overthrow Washington in the
Yeah, he was
period.
also involved in the Conway
The
Cabal, right?
Conway Cabal, right? And I think historians but you can't do that. You got to look at Gates at the time. Those things happen later, and you have to look at what he did during the campaign. And I'm plenty critical of him in this campaign, but in the end, I think his skill set fit the circumstances that he inherited, and fit them perfectly. And he was the right guy for that moment in time.
Yeah, 100%. I think that's the right approach. I think looking at history through hindsight is a big mistake because we have these biases of sort of how events shaped us and the way we look at things, and then we look at how history played out in the future and apply that to the events that took place before. So I do think it's very important to be as objective as possible and look at the events in the tense that they were taking place and not have these biases of future events and our own biases.
Yeah,
But
and it's hard. I mean, it is hard to do that, but
yeah.
you have to try to force yourself to do it.
Yeah, I think that's a great point you made earlier, though, is what sets great commanders apart is their ability to control their ego. Because guys like Napoleon and Patton and Washington, they definitely have large egos. I mean, what what's the term for like short people? They have Napoleon syndrome because of their
Napoleon
ego.
complex, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
Napoleon complex. There's a whole like phrase because of it, but the great commanders are able to channel that energy into achievement versus pettiness and you know, getting at their peers because they wrong them in some way. But the 1777 campaign kicks off, and Burgoyne goes about executing his plan, and he's completely overconfident. So, how does the initial attack by Burgoyne play out? He sails down Lake Champlain and easily takes Ticonderoga because the Americans had not properly prepared themselves. So how is he able to breeze through Ticonderoga so easily? Which I'll say in your book, you said one historian called it the back gate to the Atlantic colonies. So this was a very strategic post, and Gates or Burgoyne just waltzed right in.
Right, right. He does, and I'm not. I'm pretty critical of the American commander. There's Sinclair, General
Mm-hmm.
Sinclair.
Sure.
Um, Granted, he is given a tough job. I mean, there's no doubt about it. The people before him had not done a good job preparing, and then he's thrown in 2.5 weeks before, 3 weeks, something like that, before Burgoyne shows up. So he's not given a whole lot of time to to fix the problem. But he certainly could have prepared for the ultimate evacuation, which he does not do. So I mainly criticize him for the botched evacuation, which was just a disaster. But anyway, when Burgoyne gets there, he finds that a hill that dominates Ticonderoga has been totally ignored by the Americans. This is after both Gates and Kosciuszko had recommended that the Americans occupy that particular hill, and the hill dominates Fort Ticonderoga. So if you can get artillery up to that hill, then you basically dominate. You basically taken
This is
Ticonderoga.
Mount Defiance, right?
This is Mount Defiance, right? And today you can go to the top of that. You can hike to the top of Mount Defiance, and you can just look right down into the fort. And that, of course, that's what the Brits do. The Brits spot that. They spot this mistake, and they drag cannon. Brilliant, just a wonderful feat of both military engineering and just stick to itiveness. And they drag an artillery battery up to the top, and almost overnight, Sinclair basically loses his nerve because of that and orders the evacuation of the fort. The evacuation is a total disaster. They leave behind all these supplies and weaponry and ammunition and powder and everything else. It's a totally botched evacuation, but Burgoyne is able to basically occupy Ticonderoga within just a couple days. And in his original plan, he figured that Ticonderoga would be the toughest part of his campaign. So he seizes Ticonderoga after a 2-3 day siege, and without losing anybody, without almost firing a shot. Now there are some shots fired, there are a few casualties, but they're very minimal on both sides. And so he's just overjoyed. This is fantastic. So he thinks he's going to be able to waltz down to Albany with no problem whatsoever. Now, it's important to note that even though his tone will change later after the surrender, he never, even though he knows that Howe is going to Philadelphia and not coming up the Hudson River, he shows absolutely no concern about that at all. That was never a prerequisite for him getting to Albany. So he shows absolutely no concern whatsoever about that. So he's already confident, and this is a typical cavalry officer, very flamboyant, very aggressive, very overconfident, very confident guy. And this is going to even make him more overconfident, and it's also going to make him more contemptuous of the Americans, which he was already very contemptuous of Americans. And the easy victory at Ticonderoga is just going to feed into that. Mm-hmm. So his hubris is really kind of cranked up to the max after seizing Ticonderoga. The Americans, on the other hand, the loss of Ticonderoga, it's almost, I spend quite a bit of time on this in the book. It's a huge shock to the system. The Americans had been led to believe, the American people, the American leadership, Washington, everybody had been led to believe by a series of commanders that there's no way the Brits can seize Ticonderoga. And when they do it, and they do it so easily, it's a huge shock to the Americans. And it's because of what happens later, the great victory, it's hard to get your arms around what a shock it was. The Americans, they're almost immediately start talking about, was Schuyler and Sinclair traitors? Did they just turn over they just can't, they can't fathom what had happened. And then there's, of course, total panic in New England. The New England governors are panicking. The New York assemblies, everybody's panicking now after that. And Schuyler, the messages that the commander of the Northern Department is sending back to the commander-in-chief, Washington, and Congress indicate a guy who is totally out of his depth and a guy who is panicking, just like everybody else. Yeah. And that's certainly not something that's going to raise the optimism of Washington and Congress.
Yeah. The fall of Ticonderoga really gives Burgoyne such a false sense of confidence, and the British as a whole. I know there's a pretty funny anecdote in your book that you talk about where King George receives the letter that the British have seized Ticonderoga. He bursts into his wife's chamber saying, "We did it. We beat the Americans." And it's funny because he receives this letter, weeks after the fact, and the situation had completely changed. So it's funny to see his enthusiasm and excitement when in real time the situation had significantly deteriorated at that point.
That goes back to that tyranny of distance. He gets the news of Ticonderoga in late August, and he assumed, like Germain as well, he assumed that everything went swimmingly after seizing Ticonderoga, of course. But at the time he received it, Burgoyne has already lost the Battle of Bennington. The Americans have turned things around. They've resisted the siege of Fort Stanwix, and so things are looking up for the Americans, and things are not looking well for Burgoyne by that point.
For sure. But reading the book, whenever I read history from the American Revolution or any through any war in American history, I always get filled with so much pride to look back at my ancestors and how valiantly they fought throughout history to achieve and gain freedom, to defend it, to defend independence. And I really felt that here because they're completely humiliated and defeated at Ticonderoga. But despite this, as they are retreating back to Albany, south to Albany, they're still fighting with so much valor. And the subsequent battles, they are not easily defeated. They inflict some heavy casualties on the British. So walk me through the retreat. And even though they were just absolutely brutally humiliated at Ticonderoga, you have the Battle of Hubbardton and Skenesborough. Am I pronouncing that correctly?
Skenesboro, yeah.
Skenesborough. You have the two conflicts there where, they're still getting pushed back, but they're still fighting very strongly.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah, and I think that again, it goes to leadership. Sinclair he's just not a good leader, and hence the disaster at Ticonderoga. But at the Battle of Hubbardton, which was basically the rear guard of the garrison trying to escape, the rear guard fighting the British pursuit, basically
Yeah,
halting the British pursuit. The British won that battle, but the Americans stopped the pursuit
yeah.
and
They
allowed everybody else to get away.
they were called the rear guard that saved America.
Yes, in fact, there's a book out with almost that title, "The Battle That Saved America." I think that's a bit overblown, but it's a
Poetic. It's
it
poetic.
was really an important battle. Tiny, teeny battle. No one's ever heard of it, or very few people have heard of it. But it was really important because, as you mentioned, one thing that I mean, people have asked me. I remember somebody asked me, "What are your 5 big takeaways from the Saratoga campaign?" And one of them, and I guess it shouldn't have surprised me. Um, because I led American soldiers for 30 years in the Army, was just the resilience, their ability to bounce back. It was just amazing to me. You're right; they're totally humiliated, and almost all those soldiers that escaped Ticonderoga and were on that humiliating retreat. Uh, um, and the botched evacuation and all the stuff that went with that. Most of those guys were guys who fought the big battles at Saratoga. They were there at Saratoga at the end to win it. And they fought at Hubbardton. They fought at Skenesboro. They fought at Fort Anne. They fought at the Battle of Bennington, which was almost an entire militia operation. Not entirely, but almost. Vast majority of the folks there were militia. So I mean, it's just amazing resilience how they were able to bounce back. And I attribute that to, again, the leadership. So it's the leadership at that colonel level on down, these regimental commanders, because really most of those small battles that take place after Ticonderoga, until you get to the Battle of Bennington, most of those were colonels' battles. They were fought with smaller units, and those they had really good leadership up and down. The interesting thing about the Americans, I think, is, yeah, these guys aren't professional soldiers, but many of them had experience in the French and Indian War. Many of them had experience in Canada in 1775, 1776. And a lot of these American leaders were kind of, again, these natural leaders, these guys who had been maybe councilmen or assemblymen, or they had been mayors or something like that. Just generally just leaders of the society, leaders of just urban leaders of the village or whatever. These natural leaders that kind of rose to the top, and they just did a really nice job, and it is amazing. But I attribute it to this excellent leadership.
Mhm. But also to mention what they were fighting for, because the British are basically fighting for money. They're paid to be there, and the Americans are fighting for independence. They're fighting to establish and build their own nation for these ideals that they wholeheartedly believe in. Give me liberty or give me death. It's life or death for these guys. It's not about money or just being a career military man.
No, that's true. I wouldn't. I mean, you're absolutely right. I One of the things that and maybe because I'm a big Anglophile, and so maybe because I'm an Anglophile, I tried to be as fair as I possibly could to the British side. In fact, if you look at my entire book, there's probably more British stuff in my book than American
Yeah.
stuff.
Yeah.
And I it really struck me. I almost I almost felt sorry for those guys sometimes, the
That's
British.
true. That's true. Yeah.
Because number one, they had a really hard strategic challenge. I mean, it was a hard challenge. And then operating in these really tough environments, but these guys they fought hard. I mean, the Brits fight hard. They're fighting up to the very end. I mean, they're not giving up. Even when they're starving at the end, and their desertion rate goes up. It's always going to go up, but they're fighting hard to the bitter end, and they're fighting for things too. I mean, they especially the Brits, maybe less so the Germans because they're hired, but the British soldiers are fighting for what they're believing in too, as well. So
That's true. Yeah, that's a good point. And it definitely doesn't take away from the hardships that they went through. I mean, it must have absolutely sucked. You talk a lot in the book about, from memoirs or letters, they were talking about the heat and the bugs and the rain and the rattlesnakes. So it definitely wasn't a enjoyable experience for them whatsoever.
no,
Um,
no. I mean, if you've ever vacationed in upstate New York or upstate Minnesota or something like that, the black flies and the mosquitoes, and it's just it can not,
yeah, I'm from Florida, born and raised in Florida, so I have
oh,
I have plenty of experience with the
with
humidity and the
bugs,
heat and the
yeah,
bugs.
yeah,
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 it's definitely not fun in the summertime, right about now.
yeah,
But
yeah.
following these skirmishes, Burgoyne finds himself a little bit out of position for his original plans, and he finds himself at a crossroads. He can either continue to push overland or retreat back to Ticonderoga and advance via the river. So there's pros and cons to both. Overland, he has a lot of supply chain and logistical problems, but that is the plan he eventually goes with. So just walk me through the decision making there and what's going through his head.
Yeah, he because of the way the Americans retreated and the way the Battle of Hubbardton played out, Burgoyne, as you said, kind of finds himself not where he expected to be, and that's with most of the army at Skenesboro, which is at the very southern tip of Lake Champlain. So he had assumed that he would take Ticonderoga, and then he would use Lake George as his line of communications down to Fort George, and then there's a very good road from there that would then head south. So that was the original plan, but he finds himself in a different location, kind of away from Fort George at the very southern tip of Lake Champlain, where the road is really more of a kind of a rude farmer track through the wilderness. And he decides, well, it's gonna if I take everybody back to Ticonderoga, it's going to take some time, and I might as well just push on from here. It's a shorter distance, and again, he's overconfident. He thinks the Americans are on the run. He really doesn't think he's going to have a problem with that. He does take his heavy artillery. We'll still go the Lake George route, but the rest of the army will go over the overland route south from Skenesboro toward Fort Edward, which is right on the Hudson River. So that's his intermediate goal. So he decides to do that. Again, when you consider everything. The Americans retreating. Seems like the Americans are beaten. He's got most of the army down there anyway. Why not? It actually makes a lot of sense, except he sits there at Skenesboro for 2 weeks instead of pushing on and staying right on the heels of the retreating Americans. So instead, he sits there for 2 weeks, basically getting everybody together before he continues to push on. So what he's done is he's allowed the Americans a little bit of breathing room. The Americans start bouncing back, this resilience that you and I just talked about. They start bouncing back. Schuyler is, he kind of collects himself and he starts directing a defense, or at least trying to slow down Burgoyne's advance. And so they do that. When Burgoyne finally starts moving south along this very rough path, really it's more of a glorified path than a road, and they start having to hack their way through the wilderness, Schuyler will organize basically a defense where the Americans are ambushing them from along the road and falling trees in front of them, forcing him to move very, very slowly. Mm-hmm. Sometimes they're moving less than a mile a day, and so it's hard to conduct a campaign, a lightning fast campaign when you're moving 1 mile a day. So I think Burgoyne's big mistake there was not so much choosing the southern route that he chooses, but not immediately following up with the Americans and just keeping the pressure on and continuing to push forward. I mean, that's one of the mistakes many generals, if you look throughout history, one of the mistakes many generals make, they have a victory and then they sit still instead of following up and pursuing. That was Patton's great advantage in World War II, is he was like, never stop, keep the pressure on, keep the pressure on. That's and of course that, yes, everybody's exhausted, but the enemy's more exhausted, and we just need to take advantage of that. But instead, he stops, he collects himself, he gets everything ready before he continues to move on. A very kind of uncharacteristically, most cavalrymen tend to be more aggressive than that, but that's what he does, and so it gives the Americans some breathing room, and Schuyler will kind of do the classic trade space for time, as he will slowly retreat south while Burgoyne slowly advances because of Schuyler's effort to obstruct his route.
Yeah, and I think he underestimates the Americans again, because I don't think he realized how pesky they would be in their retreat. Like you said, felling trees. I know it was nightmarish and took many man hours to clear the roads.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting because you say that because there's several really great junior officer diaries in the British Army and memoirs, British and German. And I looked at a lot of those, and it's interesting. The younger officers, mainly the ones who fought at Hubbardton, because Burgoyne wasn't at Hubbardton, but the guys who fought at Hubbardton, they're saying, these Americans, they're pretty tough. Yeah. We didn't think they were going to be this tough. These guys are, right. These guys aren't bad. And I hope the boss knows that. It's really interesting reading their accounts.
Yeah, for sure. But I wanna move west real quick. You mentioned the siege of Stanwix earlier, and this was one of Burgoyne's columns that was moving down the Mohawk River that he planned on linking up with in Albany, I guess. But that never really comes to fruition, does it? So walk me through the siege of Stanwix, the Battle of Oriskany, and what happened, because the commander there ultimately is forced back to Canada.
Yeah. This is one of my I think this is my favorite story in the whole campaign, mainly because I knew very little about this before. And so doing the research for this it was really enjoyable. And also I almost fell in love with the American commander, Colonel Gansevoort. He's just really impressive guy. But at any rate, There was an old French and Indian fort guarding the basically the approaches to the Mohawk River called Fort Stanwix. Later renamed Fort Schuyler, but I refer to it as Fort Stanwix just to stay consistent in the book. And when this supporting column, Burgoyne's supporting column, was to come down the Mohawk River, they knew that fort was there, but their intelligence was that the Americans had let it go to ruin and it wasn't even manned. But as it turned out, it was manned. Schuyler had sent a regiment there under the command of Colonel Peter Gansevoort, who was a 26-year-old full colonel, and his second in command, Lieutenant Colonel Morenus Willett. Willett was a little bit older than his boss, but these guys formed this great command team. And over several weeks' time, so this happened in the spring, so this is before the campaign began. So Gansevoort gets there. He immediately puts his guys to work. They renovate the fort. They obstruct the routes that would be leading from the west to the fort. They stockpile ammunition and food and everything else to withstand a potential siege. And sure enough, when Burgoyne's column, commanded by Brigadier General St. Leger, when he arrives, instead of finding this derelict fort with no Americans, instead he finds this renovated fort with a bunch of plucky Americans basically saying, try to get past us, buddy. And St. Leger has to take care of the fort before he can continue on, because he's got lines of communications issues too. He can't leave an American fort in his rear. So he's got to take care of this fort. So he first, demands that the Americans surrender or he'll kill them all, and all this stuff. Americans refuse. Gansevoort basically tells him to, go pound sand. And by this time, the Americans knew about Ticonderoga. And in fact, Gansevoort's father had written him saying, well, we know you'll do a great job, and don't make a Ticonderoga of it. And so Gansevoort doesn't. His guys, they hold out 22 days against a besieging British and Native American army, basically. And while this siege, early on in the siege, an American relief force is going to try to make their way to relieve the siege. These are primarily, they're all militia. These are New York militia, and they are going to try to make their way up the Mohawk River. They're coming from the east to raise this siege. And on the way there, the British get word that they're on their way, and they send they basically establish an ambush position against these Americans. Mostly Native Americans make up this ambush force, but there's also British regulars and there's Canadian militia as well. And they execute this ambush on the American relief force, and it's a horrific battle. That's the Battle of Oriskany. By percentage of casualties, it's the bloodiest battle of the entire Revolution. Just horrible.
Really?
So many Americans are killed, but for a while there, it looks like they're going to massacre this entire relief force of about 800 Americans. But the Americans are able to withstand the initial shock of the ambush. They're able to kind of regroup, and the British and Native Americans will try numerous times to finish off the American survivors, but they're not able to. And in the meantime, while this fight is going on, just a few miles to the east of the Fort Stanwix, Colonel Willett, the American second in command, will lead a raiding party out, and they'll basically destroy the Native American camps that are surrounding Fort Stanwix. And so what that does with the British Native American allies, they lose many casualties at the Battle of Oriskany. And then when they go back to Fort Stanwix, they find their camp has been totally destroyed. And so this really hurts their morale. And so these basically the British Native American allies basically desert and leave after the Battle of Oriskany and after the raid that Colonel Willett executed. And so after, toward the end of this 22-day siege, St. Leger finds himself without his Native American allies, which made up a big portion of his force. And he gets word that another relief force is on its way. He decides to give up the siege and return to Canada. So Burgoyne then, when Burgoyne gets word that St. Leger has had to give up and go back to Canada, by that time he knows for sure that Howe is not coming up the river. And so basically 2 prongs of his 3-pronged original plan are now gone. And so now he's on his own.
Yeah, everything around Burgoyne at this point seems to be absolutely crumbling. I mean, he's dealing with logistical and supply line communication issues. He loses his western force coming down the Mohawk. Howe's not joining him. You're right, he's on his own. But at this point, he sends out a foraging party, I believe, to Bennington. And I don't think he realizes that there's this militia force under John Stark, I believe, there. And the Battle of Bennington takes place, which is another huge, crucial blow to Burgoyne. So just walk me through Bennington.
Yes. So as you mentioned, he starts running into logistical problems. Now, he had left Canada knowing that he didn't have enough logistics, mainly transport. So carts and oxen and horses and things like that. So he leaves Canada without enough of that, and he does so knowingly. And the reason he does so is he thinks he can make up that difference with loyalist support in New York. Turns out there's not that much loyalist support, or at least there's not enough loyalists to come out to support him. So he's running into big time logistical problems by the time he gets to Fort Miller, and which is south of Fort Edward. So he gets there, and he had waited. He had been delayed at Fort Edward. Now he's delayed at Fort Miller. But he hears word that there's cattle and also plenty of transport at this place called Bennington, which is just over the border into Vermont. So he puts this raiding, basically a big raid together to go capture this. So he puts together this force of about 1,000 men, almost all German, not all, but almost all German. And he sends those guys out to Bennington. And there's a few mistakes there. Number one, sending all Germans out who don't know the language, don't know the region, probably not a good idea there. He had a ready-made force that was perfect for something like that. That was his advanced force under Brigadier General Simon Fraser, probably his best, his Benedict Arnold, probably his best combat commander. So Fraser is hopping mad that he isn't given that mission. But instead, he sends this 1,000-man force out under a German lieutenant colonel. And they are ambushed as they get near Bennington. They're still on the New York side. So the Battle of Bennington actually doesn't take place at Bennington. It actually takes place in New York and not in Vermont. But they're ambushed by an American militia force under John Stark, Brigadier General John Stark, who later will coin that wonderful motto of New Hampshire, live free or die. So that's John Stark. John Stark puts together this beautiful ambush with his militia, and they're able to basically defeat this German force very, very quickly. And then a relief force is sent out by Burgoyne to try to save these guys, and they're not able to break through and save the day. So it's a huge defeat on Burgoyne's part. And just overnight, he basically loses 1,000 men. And so those are 1,000 men that he cannot afford to lose.
Yeah, crushing,
Right.
crushing defeat. He's really just stacking up the losses here now, leading into the decisive battles.
He is. And he left Canada, remember, with 10,000 men. And by the time he gets to Bennington now, because he's had to leave people behind to guard his line of communications, he's had to leave a bunch of people at Ticonderoga to man that fortification. So he's now got after he loses those 1,000 men, he's really only got a little over 6,000 men by that point.
And at this point, the American forces are starting to swell, right? They're getting a lot of militia support.
Well, militia are starting to come out, yes. By the time of the first Battle of Saratoga on the 19th of September, the forces are about equal. So they're going to be about 6,000 to 6,000 at that first Battle of Saratoga. But then after, excuse me, after that first battle, I mean, the militia is just pouring in. So by the time you get to the second Battle of Saratoga on the 7th of October,
Yeah.
only 3 weeks later, now the Americans have upwards of 11,000. And of course, Burgoyne hasn't gained anybody. He's lost people to desertion and, the battle wounds at the first battle. And by the time you get to the actual surrender, we're not exactly sure because records are pretty spotty, but it was probably upwards of about 17,000 Americans by the time you get to the surrender.
Wow. That's
And,
amazing.
and that's all those militia coming out of the
Yeah.
woodwork. Yeah.
Yeah. So around this time, our boy General Gates comes back into the picture because, like you mentioned earlier, General Schuyler, the commander of the Northern Army, he's being a little bit soft. He's being pessimistic. He's whining. He's complaining. He's not very hopeful and optimistic about their outlooks. And Congress and Washington, they're getting worried, and they're like, we can't have a guy like this in command of an army. We need a strong leader. So Schuyler gets the boot. Gates takes command. So this kind of sets the stage for, the two battles of Saratoga. So now Gates is in charge. Walk me through the situation to the buildup of Freeman's Farm, which is the first battle of Saratoga.
So Gates takes over, as you mentioned, and he starts moving now the army Schuyler had pulled the army all the way back to just north of Albany. So he had pulled them really far back. By this time, Washington had sent forward a lot of reinforcements, particularly reinforcements in senior leaders. He felt after the loss of Ticonderoga that the thing that Schuyler really needed was kind of some steel in the backbone. So he sends up some really good leaders. And he also knows Schuyler isn't very good with the militia. The militia doesn't like Schuyler. So that's a problem. So he's going to send up leaders who are good with militia. So that's why he sends Benedict Arnold up there. Arguably his most dynamic, aggressive combat commander. He sends him up there. This is before Gates even is in command. He sends Benjamin Lincoln up there, who's really good with militia. And he sends several other people up there as well. And then, of course, he'll end up sending Colonel Daniel Morgan and his riflemen. So the way I look at those guys is almost think of those guys as, Rangers or, American Rangers or Special Forces or SEAL Team 6.
For sure.
The kind of unit that everybody wants, but there's only one of them. So you got to be careful about how you use those guys. And it shows out Washington, to me, Washington is the unsung hero of this entire campaign. It shows that Washington, he's willing to give up his most elite force to go up and help those guys up in the north when he could have obviously used them in his campaign against Howe. But at any rate, all that is happening. And when Gates takes over, he starts moving the army north. And what he's going to look for is some good defensible ground on the west side of the river, because he knows that if Burgoyne is going to continue to come south, he's going to have to cross over to the west side, because that's the only place where there's a road net that heads south. So he moves north, and he sends basically a reconnaissance party forward to find the best defensible terrain. And included in that party is Colonel Kosciuszko again. And Kosciuszko finds this wonderful piece of high ground that dominates not only the river, the Hudson River, but also the road to Albany, the main road to Albany. And that's a place called Bemis Heights. And so he picks that terrain. Gates approves it. And Kosciuszko will basically lay out the defensive positions. And the Americans will start digging in on Bemis Heights. Burgoyne, after the Battle of Bennington, now basically has all the information he needs to make an informed decision on, do I continue to push ahead, or do I focus on saving the army at this point? And instead, the choice he makes is, I'm going to continue to push ahead. He'll argue later that his orders gave him no alternative. He had to push ahead, which is actually wrong, because his orders there was a clause in his orders that said, at all times, use your discretion. So at any rate, he pushes forward. He makes that fateful decision, probably the most important decision he's going to make in the entire campaign. They cross the river to the west side. At that point, he's basically cut his lines of communications, and he moves south, and he runs in the Americans. By this time, all of his Indians, his Native Americans who have supported him with the army, have deserted, because after Bennington, they saw the writing on the wall that Burgoyne apparently couldn't read, and they all desert. And so he had used the Native Americans as his cavalry, for scouting and for screening his army. Well, those guys are gone now. And so now the Americans know exactly where he is, exactly where he's moving. They don't have to worry about the Indians running into Native Americans in the woods anymore, because his are gone. Burgoyne's are gone. And so the Americans spot all of his movements. They know exactly where he is. And Burgoyne decides that he's going to defeat these Americans by... Should we talk about Freeman's Farm at this point?
Yeah.
Okay. So Burgoyne comes up with a plan. Remember, he still thinks he can beat these Americans. He's already beaten them before. He's still pretty confident, even though he's lost. He's had these losses, these setbacks. So he's going to conduct this three-pronged attack, where these three columns will advance. And when one of these columns run into the Americans, they'll basically fix the Americans, and the other columns will then pile on, and then he'll be able to defeat them. But what happens is, when the Americans see these columns coming, Gates will send Colonel Morgan and his riflemen, along with his light infantry support under Major Dearborn. They will attack the center British column, start inflicting heavy casualties on this British column. The British will, the two other columns will march to the aid of the center column. The Americans will send more regiments and brigades out to fight this fight out of the fortifications. Burgoyne will send primarily the left wing of his army out to fight this fight at Freeman's Farm under Benedict Arnold. Arnold will not get too involved in this fight himself. He'll basically just send forces into the fight, but he won't get too involved in the Freeman's Farm fight. But the Americans, even though the Americans will ultimately fall back, they stop Burgoyne's attack cold, because they inflict heavy casualties on Burgoyne. And even though Burgoyne is able to say he won the battle because he held on to the battlefield, the Americans will inflict 3 times the casualties that they'll suffer on Burgoyne. And of course, these are casualties that Burgoyne cannot deal with. So Burgoyne, again, it's decision time. Do I fall back and save the army, or do I continue to push on to Albany? And right around this time that he's trying to make this decision, sorry, I need to put my phone on silent. I apologize for that. Around the time he decides, or he's trying to make this decision, he's thrown a lifeline by General Clinton. Now, General Clinton, Henry Clinton, has been, he's back in New York. He is Howe's second in command. He's been left there while Howe conducts the Philadelphia campaign with a small force. And when Howe leaves for Philadelphia, he gives Clinton this sort of vague, well, if you find you have the opportunity to help Burgoyne, see what you can do. So Clinton had sent a message to Burgoyne. All the reports that Clinton had received from Burgoyne said, hey, everything's going swimmingly. I took Ticonderoga. I'm chasing the Americans. Everything's going great. So Clinton thinks everything's fine. But then he gets this report from Burgoyne saying, holy crap, I'm in big, big trouble. I need you to come and rescue me. And so Clinton goes, whoa, okay, that's a big change. I'll see what I can do. Clinton puts together this small force because he doesn't have much available. He puts together a small force, and he tries to come up the river to help Burgoyne, or at least to take some pressure off Burgoyne. Clinton had never had any illusion that he'd be able to come up and actually fight a big pitched battle against Gates and save Burgoyne. But he's hoping that maybe he can draw some of those forces away from Burgoyne. So he goes up the river. He quickly seizes the American forts at Fort Montgomery and Fort Clinton. He'll continue up the river, but the closest he gets is about 50 miles south of Albany. Because he starts running into Americans are everywhere now. Of course, the militia is everywhere. They're all coming out. And Clinton will turn back and go back to New York. Unfortunately for Burgoyne, he never gets, the other messengers that Clinton will send to Burgoyne never make it through the American lines. So Burgoyne never gets the word that Clinton has had to turn back. So he sits there and he has to cut rations twice. And in the meantime, all sorts of the American militia is just pouring in now to Bemis Heights. By the time you get to the early October, now there's about 11,000 Americans instead of 6,000 Americans. And Burgoyne is now desperate. Some of his generals beg him to retreat back to Ticonderoga, but Burgoyne decides that he's going to conduct basically a reconnaissance in force to see if maybe, number one, if he can forage for some food, because his animals are dying now too, as well as his men starting to starve. So this reconnaissance in force is going to either to do two things. Number one, forage for food. That's the most important thing. Number two, see if maybe there's a way that they can get around the Americans, and then try to do that the next day. So on the 7th of October, he sends this reconnaissance force out. He basically personally leads this reconnaissance force out, this 2,000-man reconnaissance force. The Americans immediately spot this movement, and of course, they're going to respond. Gates, like he did with the first battle, he'll send Morgan out along with their infantry support. And they immediately start inflicting heavy casualties on this British reconnaissance force. And then Gates will also send another brigade out. And pretty soon they're crushing this reconnaissance force. Burgoyne orders a retreat. The retreat is totally disorganized. There's leaders are falling left and right. In fact, Simon Fraser, his best combat commander, is mortally wounded during this retreat. And pretty soon they fall back into their British fortifications, but the Americans are right on their heels. Arnold asks Gates for more reinforcements because he thinks he can break through the British fortifications. Arnold is ultimately able to do that, although he is seriously wounded himself. But the Americans seize the far right of the British flank, and now the Americans are there in force on Burgoyne's flank, and he has no choice but the next day to order a retreat. Finally,
It's crazy to see how quickly things went from, overconfident and we're going to breeze through to absolute disaster. You talk in the book about grip, commanders having grip. Would you say that Burgoyne didn't necessarily have the grip that was required here?
yeah, I think clearly he didn't. Grip is the way I define grip is a commander who not only has command of all the stuff a commander has to know. What is my logistical situation? Where are all my units? What is the situation with each one of my units? What are the ones I can count on? All those commander business stuff. But also, it's a commander with grip has a step beyond that. Somebody with some intuition, somebody who's able to look at a battlefield and be able to make decisions even without perfect information. No, Burgoyne is definitely not that guy for sure. I think Washington had grip. Unfortunately, sometimes his the tools he was using could not execute what he wanted
Yeah.
them to do. I think he had grip. People like Patton had grip.
Oh,
U.S. Grant had grip. Napoleon obviously had grip. Rommel had grip. These guys who had this innate, intuition. Definitely, Burgoyne did not have it.
yeah. So ultimately, he's just, the complete victory. He was crushed completely and he's forced to surrender. So, what exactly does the surrender of an army look like? These are thousands of men that are now captured. Where do they go? What's the process like for this?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there's it definitely adds a big headache to the winning commander. I mean,
Yeah.
what do you do with these guys now? You got to feed them, you've got to take care of them, and you have to secure them because you don't. They're a security risk, obviously. So, as what maybe Burgoyne lacked in generalship, he made up for in negotiating skills because he negotiated a very favorable terms for his army's surrender. And the terms were basically okay. We will agree to surrender, but you have to let us go back to England. We'll promise never to fight in America again. We'll give our parole, but we'll go back to England. And so Gates agreed to those terms. And the reason he agreed to them, I believe, is he was worried about Clinton coming up the river behind him. And so he just wanted to end it. The sooner I can get Burgoyne's surrender, I'll do it. So, as terms of this surrender document, which was called the Saratoga Convention, the British Army would be marched to Boston, and once they got to Boston, they would be embarked on British ships and taken back to England, promising never to serve in America again. But of course, what that all that meant was the British would just, give them other missions and send forces in Britain to replace them. So, a troop, an army is fungible, just like money is fungible.
Yep.
And so it's um, really favorable terms because in this way they wouldn't lose an entire army. So they marched to Boston, and when Washington and Congress gets word of the surrender, of course they're thrilled. They're very thrilled. In fact, this is the origin of the first American Thanksgiving. Is the surrender of the British at Saratoga? Washington declares a day of Thanksgiving because of that, or Washington Congress, I forget which one. But they're not happy about the surrender terms at all.
Yeah.
So Washington tells the American commander at Boston, who was responsible for taking care of these British soldiers, he basically tells them, look, they have to agree, they have to follow every single, and there were like 12 provisions on the surrender document. You make sure that they follow everything to the letter, and if they don't, we're not sending them home. And so, so one of the provisions was something along the lines of, the surrendered units will give up their colors and all of their, muskets and all this stuff. Well, there were a couple of the British regiments that hid their colors. They didn't want to give up their colors. And so the Americans said, well, you haven't lived up to this surrender document, so you're not going home. And so basically they said, you violated the surrender document that you signed. So you're still our prisoners, but you're not going home. And so basically these British soldiers never got home. And so they were called from that point on the Convention Army. And so the Americans will then spend the rest of the war marching these guys to and fro across America, keeping them away from any other British armies who would, we thought would try to rescue these guys.
Right.
So we marched them to Charlottesville, Virginia. We marched them to Lancaster, Pennsylvania. So they went from Boston to Charlottesville to Lancaster. I mean, just back and forth and back and forth.
What a headache.
I remember when I was a young second lieutenant driving to my first post at Fort Belvoir, Virginia, and passing these roadside markers saying, the Convention Army passed through here. And I had no idea what they were talking about. And it was Burgoyne's army, basically.
Wow.
And so what ends up happening is a lot of these guys, obviously, some of them died of disease and things as prisoners of war. But many of them, many Brits and Germans decided that they liked what they saw being marched around America. And they stayed in America and became American citizens after the war. A lot of the officers were exchanged. Burgoyne was allowed to go home. He complained about ill health, so he was allowed to go home in the spring of 78. Where once he got home, he was obviously had to answer lots of questions.
Yeah, he got grilled
when he got home. Yeah. Other officers were exchanged for American prisoners and so forth. But again, a lot of those guys ended up being American citizens after the war.
That's so ironic because, these guys are fighting the Americans because Americans are fighting for their independence, and these guys are trying to crush that rebellion. And then they end up, starting a life and living in this newly founded United States, this independent free nation. That's pretty ironic conclusion to that story.
Yeah, it is. It's sort of sad too, because like I said, there were a lot of them died of disease and things like that.
And I'm sure a lot of them probably had to leave family behind in England.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, definitely sad. Looking back on the Saratoga campaign, I know this is a broad question, but where did American commanders go right where British commanders went wrong?
Well,
if you could sort of sum it up.
Yeah, I mean, with something like this, I almost go back to the great British historian Michael Howard, who wrote at one point that, look, all you got to do is you got to get it better than the other guy. You got to be a little bit better than the other guy. And in this campaign, from Ticonderoga on, we got it better than the other guy. And sometimes it was just a little bit better. Sometimes it was a lot better. But we got it a little bit better. And I think a lot of that had to do with, again, I think our senior level leadership was better, which is almost counterintuitive because you would think that the professional military officer would be better.
Right.
But our senior officers just made better decisions along the way. And I think also, we knew the terrain, we understood the geography. They didn't. They had this totally incorrect notion of what it would take to campaign in America. Uh, and,
Naivete
I, and
almost.
I think that was one of those fundamental errors that they made. And it was the faulty strategy. I mean, it was
Yeah.
it's really hard to overcome a bad strategy, and they had a bad strategy. I think what they should have done is they should have put all the eggs in Howe's basket. I think if had they taken, Burgoyne's army, moved them by sea because they had total control of the sea, moved them by sea, linked up with Burgoyne or Howe rather, and Howe would now have this big, immense army. I think he may have been able to you never know. He may have been able to run down Washington and finally and defeat him, but you never know.
I think honestly, I think even if the British were able to militarily defeat them, I think the war was unwinnable because you already have this American identity that they have formed for themselves and these ideals that they've created for themselves. And you have this island 3,000 miles away trying to control that. Even if they had been militarily defeated, it just would have been a headache to still manage. And I think independence would have been won eventually anyway.
Yeah, you might be right about that. I just think militarily their best chance
Yeah.
was
Was
Howe's
how?
strategy, but
Probably. You're
even
probably
then
right.
that may have been too little, too late.
Yeah. But Kevin, I want to thank you so much for coming on. I am greatly looking forward to reading the rest of this book. I hope
Good. I'm
to get
glad you
that
enjoyed
done
it.
in the next few days, but it was fantastic, wonderful conversation. So thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thanks, Jake. I really enjoyed it.